Hi, Jenni here, and in my time as an avid reader, I have read many different lists of the top 10 top most important classics that everyone should read. So the point of this video is to go through 3 of those, see how many books I've read in these lists, how similar are they sharing the same classics, and how they define classics, because it's no surprise books that we still consider classics are mostly Western centered, white centered, and male centered. So I want to see how much variety is there, how many different countries, how many different kinds of authors, and so on. I do have a master's degree in English, which included literature studies, and additionally I studied literature as my minor, but this was literature in Finnish, where we went through the history of literature, Finnish literature classics, and then international, mostly English classics. So I do have some kind of knowledge about this topic as well. I have not gone through these lists beforehand, so let's see if they surprise me. Let's get into it. So my first list is from the publisher Macmillan, and the title of their article is Classic Books That Read at Least Once in Your Lifetime. This is a 4-minute read. There's no author, at least I couldn't find it yet. From the gothic horror of Frankenstein to the social satire of Pride and Prejudice, here is our edit of the best classic books to read at least once in your life. And then they define how they view a classic novel. Italian writer Italo Calvino defined classics as books which, the more we think we know them through hearsay, the more original, unexpected, and innovative we find them when we actually read them. And then from Macmillan, the publishing company, Harriet Sanders says that classic has to have endured and stood the test of time. They will deal with themes that are still relevant today, universal themes. Alright, the first one is Pride and Prejudice. I have read that one. It is arguably a huge classic. Then Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. So we have an American author here. I have not read that one. And then there are always articles about the author. Middlemarch by George Eliot. Oh, definitely this deserves to be here. I just made a whole video about it. It is a masterpiece. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I have not read that one. There have been quite many female authors featured on this list, already 3. Greyfriars Bobby by Eleanor Atkinson. I have not heard of this. I'm not even sure I pronounce this correctly. But yeah, another female author. Jesus. Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. I have read that one. Definitely deserves to be here. Orlando by Virginia Woolf. I have read that one. I wrote an essay on it as well. Deserves to be here as well. Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. So this is the first black author here. I have read this one. Very important to include here. Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I have read this one. I don't really care for it, but it's definitely considered a classic. The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I have read that one. Yes. It's pretty interesting. The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. I have not read this one. According to Macmillan, it's one of the most influential sci-fi books of all time. Don Quixote, Miguel de Cervantes. Okay, so I think this is the first one that was not originally in English. I have not read this one, but I've heard great things about it. Women of the Harlem Renaissance by Marisa Constantino. A very important classic. James Weldon Johnson's book, The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man. So that's the title of the book. I have not read this one, but seems really important and very interesting. Quite modern, possibly. I don't know the release here. On the Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. Passing by Nella Larsen. I've seen the movie that's based on this. Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. I have not read this one. Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. I have not read that one, but of course constantly referenced in culture, so definitely. Another one that's constantly referenced in culture, Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Wonderful Adventures of Mrs. Seacole in Many Lands. I have read this one. I thought it was interesting but a bit all over the place. It was a bit hard to follow, but definitely worth being called classic. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll. Definitely a notable children's book that I've read. Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. I have not heard of that one. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. So we have a female main character written by a man, okay? And that's it. I had read quite many books from this list. I thought they had brought up some really interesting books here. Not ones that you would usually expect from a list like this. So I thought that was a pretty good one. And there were a lot of female authors. Not many black and authors of color, but a few. Alright, so that was Pan Macmillan. Moving on to Forbes, which is like a financial magazine. They have 30 best classic novels everyone should read. Oh boy, it's gonna take a while. I'll try to go through these quickly. This article was written by Tony Fitzgerald. Number 30, Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe from 1958. Quite a modern book. The author is from Nigeria. I have not heard of this book. Native Son by Richard Wright. The author of the acclaimed memoir Black Boy first published this novel about Bigger Thomas, a young black man in Chicago who accidentally kills a white woman. This was published in 1940, so quite new. Okay, even newer. Roots by Alex Haley, 1976. I have not heard of this one. So this list has a very different goal from the Pan Macmillan one. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey, 1962. Again, another modern classic. The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton, 1967. Again, another one I haven't heard about. Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I think this is the first one that was on both lists. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, again, was on previous lists as well. Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, again, another more modern one, 1952. Have not heard of this one. To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. Released in 1960, obviously a classic. I guess it's been read at schools in the United States. I have not read this one. The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, 1951, definitely a classic. I have not read that one. Again, Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes, which was in the previous video as well. Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. So interesting, the other list didn't feature any John Steinbeck. I haven't read any books from him, but I've heard great things. Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. I have not read that one. 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. That one I really want to read. Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zoraniel Hurston from 1937. A critique of American gender roles and race relations. Okay, this sounds super interesting. I have not read it. The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. 1989. I mean, Kazuo Ishiguro is a very famous author, so definitely I think deserves to be in the classics list, definitely. But I think 1989 is quite new to be seen in the classics list. However, that was like 30 years ago, over 30 years ago at this point, so yeah. My Antonia by Willa Cather, or Cather, released in 1918. I have not read this one, so I don't know. Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. Again, another book that was mentioned in the previous list. Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh, released in 1945. I have not heard of this. Lord of the Flies by William Golding. I have heard of this. I have not read the whole book. Some snippets here and there. Obviously, very well considered to be a classic. Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. Again, definitely worth to be mentioned on a classics list. The Color Purple by Alice Walker. Definitely. Like, there's a movie, there's a musical of the book as well. So it's a very timeless, impactful story. It won the Pulitzer Prize and National Book Award, as mentioned here. I still haven't read it, but I really want to. Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. Released in 1719, so I think this is one of the older books on this list. I have not read it. Charlotte's Web by E.B. White, I think. Another children's book. I have not read this one, but yeah, I think it well deserves to be on this list. The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. Absolutely. It was released in 1950. I have read this one. Hugely meaningful to me. Yes, it is a Christian parable, but I feel like it's much more than just that. And yeah, I'm glad that it's being recognized in this Forbes list. Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Again, this was also mentioned in the other list. I have not read it, so I don't have an opinion on it, but I'm sure it's worthy of being in this list. Middlemarch by George Eliot. You see, this is already the second list that it's mentioned on, therefore everyone should read it. The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton, released in 1920. I have this one on my shelf. I tried to read it once, but I couldn't really get into the story. Maybe I'll try it again. Number 2, The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. Definitely worth being here on this list, obviously. I have not read this one, but definitely worthy being on this list. And The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, released in 1970. It says here any of the Toni Morrison's novels could easily make the list. Definitely, I agree. I've read one. I read it in Finnish, so I'm not sure what the name is in English. But yeah, definitely Toni Morrison deserves to be here. I think this one had a pretty nicely even authors. There weren't that many books that were originally in a different language. Don Quixote, Kazuo Ichiguro, and Chinua Achebe, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez. But a bit more than in the first one. Very diverse genre-wise. Okay, so that was the Forbes list. I thought it was interesting. There were more languages considered in this list than in the first one. And there were quite a few female and male authors. Yeah, I think it was a solid list. Okay, and the last one is from Penguin, 100 must-read classics as chosen by our readers. This article is written by Sarah McKenna and Penguin editors from May 2022. So this is a bit different from other ones because 1, it has 100 books, and 2, it's been voted by the readers. Okay, so let's see if I agree. First one is Pride and Prejudice. Mentioned on all of the 3 lists, so yeah, good. To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. Yeah. The Great Gatsby I have read. It was mentioned also in the Forbes list. 100 Years of Solitude, also in the Forbes list. I would love to read this Gabriel Garcia Marquez book. We'll probably read it this year. In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. I have not heard of this. Quite a modern book, a newer book. White Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys. Seems very interesting. Released in 1966, so a bit more modern. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. I have not heard of this one. A dystopian novel. I Captured the Castle by Dodie Smith. Released in 1948. I've never heard of this one. This is a children's book. That's nice. Jane Eyre, once again, on this list. 1847. Deserves to be on the list, but I didn't really care for it. Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Yeah, makes sense. The Secret History by Donna Tartt. I have not read this one yet. I do have it in my shelf, but I'm a bit hesitant about reading it. I think this is the newest book that has been featured in one of these lists. So it's a bit hard to say if it's a classic yet. The Call of the Wild by Jack London. I have not heard of this one. About Jack London, who was a gold prospector in the Canadian wilderness. Okay, interesting. Persuasion by Jane Austen. I'm glad that Persuasion is featured. Just this morning I saw a post on Bookstagram saying that they didn't really understand Persuasion and that they feel distant from it. Like, it's so amazing. It's so deep and painful when we look at Anne Elliot's life, and yeah, I'm glad that Persuasion was featured here. Okay, Victor Hugo, Les Miserables, of course. Moby Dick, again. To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, so a different Virginia Woolf book. I like this one fine. Worthy of being on the list. The Death of the Heart by Elizabeth Bowen. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Okay, so it was mentioned in all 3 of these lists, so definitely a classic. The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. I've not heard of that one. The Go-Between by Albie Hartley, 1953. Okay, interesting. The Iliad by Homer. Okay, so I guess this is the oldest one here. Definitely worthy of classic status. I have not read that one. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Casey. I think this was in the Forbes list as well. 1984 by George Orwell. I'm really surprised that This is the only list that mentions 1984. I thought it was good, fine. I didn't really care for it, but definitely worth being here. Once again, The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. Toni Morrison, Beloved. Another Toni Morrison book mentioned. Definitely an impactful author. The God of the Woosters by P.G. Wodehouse. I have not heard of that one. Dracula by Bram Stoker. Very interesting. Definitely worth being here. The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. I have not heard of that one. So from what I'm gathering, this might be the most diverse list so far, in the sense that there are books that, well, I haven't heard of, maybe others have. But again, this is a much longer list, so maybe that's why. The Chrysalis by John Wyndham. I have not heard of that one. War and Peace, Leo Tolstoy. Of course I've heard of that one. I mean, I don't know. I can't say it's worthy of being called a classic, but of course it is. Of course it is. Charles Dickens, Great Expectations. Another Charles Dickens book mentioned. James Baldwin, Another Country. First James Baldwin. The other two did not have James Baldwin, which is so wrong. He is an incredible author. Catch-22, once again. The Age of Innocence by Edith Waters. Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. I think this was the same book as well. George Eliot, Middlemarch. Middlemarch mentioned in all three lists. Everyone should read it. This is a stunning version, by the way. Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Not heard of that one. Thomas Hardy, Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Not heard of this one. The cover is stunning though. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray, mentioned once again. Evelyn Waugh, Brideshead Revisited. I think this was on Forbes list as well. Gustave Flaubert's Madame Bovary. This was also mentioned. The Mill and the Floss by George Eliot. So this is the only list that featured 2 George Eliot books. I've not read this one. I would really love to. Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. Have not heard of that one. Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence. Have heard of that one. 1960. I did not realize it was that new. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. Again, I've heard many great things about this one. John Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath. Forbes list also featured John Steinbeck. James Joyce Ulysses. Nah, read that one. East of Eden by John Steinbeck. The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. Interesting that the Forbes list featured The Hobbit, and then this list features The Lord of the Rings. Again, I have not read it. It'll be interesting to see if The Hobbit is featured here too. The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Again, another classic I've not read. Buddenbrooks by Thomas Mann. Never heard of it. Semi-autobiographical family epic. Okay, sounds interesting. Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. I've not read this one, but sure, it is a classic. The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. I've not read this one, but I've read The Little Princess, if I remember correctly. Again, it's nice to feature children's books as well. Scoop by Evelyn Waugh. Never heard of this one. Love in a Cold Climate by Nancy Mitford. I've not heard of this one. A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. This was in a different list too, right? The Diary of a Nobody by George Grossmith and Whedon Grossmith. Not heard of that one. The cover looks quite modern considering it's from 1892. Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Not read that one, but I can definitely understand what's here. Alessandro Manzoni, The Betrothed, from 1827. I've not read that one either. Again, Virginia Woolf Orlando was mentioned in another list as well. Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. Not heard of this one. Another dystopian American novel. The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. There was a H.G. Wells book in Forbes list as well. The Art of War by Tzu Sun. I've not heard of this one, but there's not even year of release, so it must be an old one. John Galsworthy, The Forsyte Saga, Volume 1. Nobel Prize winning author, but I've not read this one. John Steinbeck, Travels with Charlie. Okay, so the Penguin readers definitely love John Steinbeck. Henry Miller, Tropic of Cancer. Not read this one. Don Quixote by Miguel Cervantes. This was in the Forbes list as well. Staying On by Paul Scott. I have not read this one. This was released in 1977, quite a new one. The Wind of the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. This is a children's book as well. So sweet. I've not read it. The Quiet American by Graham Greene. I've not read this one. Wuthering Heights. I think this is the third list that Emily Bronte's book is mentioned on. Patrick Süskind Perfume, The Story of a Murderer. I've not heard of this one. 1985, so it's pretty new, considered to be classic. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. The other list did not feature this one. Of Human Bondage by W. Somerset Maugham. Never heard of this one. Bleak House by Charles Dickens. Another Dickens book. Well, shows that Dickens is a quite famous classics author, stating the obvious. Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. So that's 3 Jane Austen books mentioned in this list. The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. Yep, makes sense. Very impactful. A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Now, this is the only Charles Dickens book that I've read. Silas Marner by George Eliot. I've not even heard of this one before, but this is the 3rd George Eliot, so another favorite of Penguin readers. Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. I've not read this one, but again, another Woolf. So it's really clear that some authors are preferred over others. Little Women, okay, mentioned in all 3 lists. The Sea by Iris Murdoch. Not heard of this one. David Copperfield. Charles Dickens. I've lost count how many Charles Dickens books are on this list. Franz Kafka, The Castle. I've not read this one, but Kafka is an impactful author. I, Claudius by Robert Graves. I've not heard of this one either. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. I've read that one. Was heavy, was very dark, very worth being called a classic. John Kennedy Toole, A Confederacy of Dunces. Not heard of that one. The Razor's Edge by W. Somerset Maugham. So another book from this author. Lark Rides to Candleford. I've not heard of this one before. Okay, last 10. Return of the Native by Thomas Hardy. I've not heard of this one. James Joyce, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. I've not heard of this one, but James Joyce is a very impactful author as well. House of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. I've heard of this one, but I've not read it. It's a novella, apparently. North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. I think I've heard of this one as well. The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. I have read this one. It's very relevant to this day, so definitely worth being called a classic. James Baldwin Jones. I love this one so much, and I'm so glad that it's featured here. The Godfather by Mario Puzo. I didn't know that Godfather is based on a book. Well, obviously the movie is world famous, and I know references from it, even though I've never seen it, so it makes sense that it's mentioned here as well. The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. Not read that one. One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I've not heard of that one. Fyodor Dostoevsky, White Nights. I think this is 3rd Dostoevsky mentioned on this list. Hard Times by Charles Dickens. Okay, and that's where it ends. The Penguin list was very varied in the sense that there were multiple genres, and they included many books from certain authors, not just the one famous one, which I think is interesting, but it does take away from other authors. Somewhat diverse regarding original language. There were many Russian classics and some that were also mentioned in other lists. Quite balanced when it comes to male and female authors. Origin of the author, I think overall in all 3 of them was a bit lacking, so very much focused on the Western Hemisphere. And I get it, we live in a Western-centric world, but I hope in the future these lists would feature authors from different places. Obviously, I just looked at classics. What even is a classic? Is it a certain time period? Is it certain genre? It's really hard to say. But overall, I think when it came to diversity and the most varied backgrounds and varied genres, I think the Forbes list was the most interesting one. But I also think the Penguin list one, since it was voted by readers, I feel like that reflected really well in the list as well. I have a lot of books to read because I had not read many books from each of the lists, so yeah. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to hear more book updates from me, follow me on Bookstagram, jenskosmos, and I hope I see you in the next one. Bye!